In this little lecture we're going to have a look at the way languages vary and change. Languages are not one big, unchanging entity, although it's comforting for us to think that we speak English or German or Kiswahili. That doesn't mean that all of us speak it in exactly the same way. There's another way of thinking about that, and that is to say that we don't all share the same language. We don't share identical rule systems with every other speaker, and so in a way that casts doubt on the idea of a language. So we're essentially asking, what is a language? Obviously, if we don't all share exactly the same rules, then we don't all speak exactly the same language. You and I speak differently. If you're from Africa and I'm from Hong Kong, if I'm from Hong Kong, then some of the features of my English will be affected by the fact that I also speak Cantonese. The most spectacular place to see how languages are different is the way they change over time. If we take a long enough time period, it turns out that earlier versions of our language, English, are completely incomprehensible to us now. English was first spoken in England about 700 AD. It wasn't spoken in England before that because the English that is our language was initially spoken in continental Europe by a group of people who came across the Channel to England in various tribes. They weren't all speaking the same language even then, although they could understand each other. So, if we look at that English, it's incomprehensible. The first lines of Beowulf start, Hwetwe gardena in yer dagum. What is that? That's English, but totally different from the English now. So, language varies in time, but it also varies in geographic space. When the English arrived in England, as we've said, they didn't speak exactly the same way. The English spoken in different parts of England was different. So some tribes settled in the north, some in the centre, some in Kent, and some in the southwest. That's where some of the dialects that are currently spoken in England derive from. How do we know that long ago people spoke differently? The monks and priests who first wrote English wrote it with a Latin alphabet and tried to capture the English as it was spoken around them, the English that they spoke themselves. They didn't have a sense that there was some sort of standard English. They just recorded what they and the people around them sounded like, as close as they could get using a Latin alphabet. From those early writings, we know that the English was different in different parts of England. So we can say they spoke mutually intelligible dialects of English. We also know that English is not the same in geographic space now. There are many different Englishes spoken around the world, and one of the things that has happened in the third edition of Kuiper and Allan is we've tried to draw attention to those different Englishes. For example, the Englishes of the British Isles. In the former Celtic-speaking parts of England and Scotland and Wales, the British Isles, the Welsh English and the Scots English and the Irish English sound different. Of course, these areas are partly isolated. Ireland is an island and the Scots are up in the Highlands and the lowlands of Scotland, and gradually their Englishes have come to take on a character of their own. In North America, the English spoken in the southern states is different from the English spoken, for example, in New England and in the northwest of the United States, or in Canada for that matter. In the southern hemisphere, the languages, if you like, the Englishes spoken there, Australian, South African and New Zealand English, are all identifiably different. South African English, for example, is affected by the fact that when English speakers arrived there, there were already European speakers who spoke Afrikaans living there, and so some aspects of South African English have been influenced by Afrikaans, as they have been influenced by the vocabulary, for example, of a number of the indigenous languages of southern Africa. Then, not only do we have settler societies, as we have in, for example, England, where the settlers were the English who came across, in North America, where the English colonized North America, and Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, where we have settler societies, but also we have former colonial parts of the English Empire where the language of administration was English, and where new Englishes have emerged. For example, in Africa, the country of Nigeria uses English as the language of civil administration and higher education, and the English that's developed in Nigeria is identifiably different, and of course it has traits of some of the African languages that are also spoken in Nigeria. In the Caribbean, the English were never a majority. Many Caribbean islands consist of slaves who are now the citizens of those islands, and they speak differently from the Africans who are still left in Africa. In South Asia, we have India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. If you've followed cricket at all and listened to Pakistani players and Indian players talking, they sound different and they have different vocabulary, not for cricket, but certainly for food and other aspects of their material culture. In Southeast Asia, the English of Hong Kong, Singapore and Malaysia has been affected by the fact that people there are bilingual, as they are in Africa and South Asia. Hong Kong people by and large speak Cantonese. In Singapore, a number of Chinese languages are spoken, along with a number of languages of the subcontinent, and in Malaysia people are basically Malay speakers, or speakers of Indian languages, or speakers of Chinese languages. Those have had an influence on their English. But language also varies in social space. In the same society, not everyone speaks English in exactly the same way. If one goes to Singapore, for example, people in Singapore who have been through the Singapore National University speak something quite close to standard English, whereas the people in the marketplace who have had relatively little education speak English in rather a different way. So there the English varies according to social stratification. Not everybody speaks English the same way. Women and men often speak English differently. Young and old can speak differently. Young people often have a number of new expressions that the old don't understand. Grandparents are often bemused by the language of their grandchildren. We speak differently in formal and informal situations. How do we track these changes, these ways of having a language be both the same and different at the same time? Well, languages have within them the capacity for varying, and they do this by means of linguistic variables. Linguistic variables are basically different ways of saying the same thing. For example, I can say, I am not coming, or I aren't coming. They both basically say the same thing, but they're different ways of saying it. One of those is more formal than the other most of the time. I am not coming is rather more formal than I aren't coming. So this is a variable. It's sensitive to particular social facts. I ain't done nothing is said in a number of dialects of English, whereas I haven't done anything is said in others. You're not saying anything different by saying it in these two different ways, and certainly some people think the first is substandard, but that's their problem. So what kinds of linguistic variables are there? Variables potentially exist in all areas of a language. They exist in its vocabulary. If you call something a sofa or call it a couch, that could be a variable depending on any number of factors. We can have sounds that are different. Some people say singin' and some people say singing. In the world's Englishes, singin' is generally more often used by men than by women. By and large that's the case. You'll notice too that I've said by and large and more often. We're talking here about statistical tendencies and not absolutes. He do be comin' is said in some places, and he is coming is said in other places. Well, those are variables, they say the same thing, and they're grammatical, but they express the same basic proposition. So what we've said in this little lecture is that languages vary, they change, and so the idea of an immutable language, one single solid language, doesn't in fact hold up. Languages can be seen as a whole conglomeration of variables, all under the same umbrella to be sure, and sharing some basic characteristics, but still varying rather a lot. It's not exactly like the colour of cars, so that if you drive a Volkswagen Beetle, a red Beetle and a green Beetle are more or less the same, but it's something like that.